Hi everyone, I'm Shelly and you're watching There's No Place Like Home. Today's Question the Narrative video was actually unplanned. I hadn't planned on doing another one until later on this week, but I was inspired by an article that I came across earlier today, and it really got me thinking about the different tactics that are possibly used to hide history. Hence the name of today's segment is Question the Narrative, Hiding History 101. And so I found this interesting quote by Joss Whedon, and it's very true. Half of writing history is hiding the truth. And so let's go to this article that I found today. So as you can see, it was first written on November 9th, so it is recent. And it says, archaeologists forced to rebury unusual discovery in old Aztec capital. And it got me thinking, first of all, of a photo that I saw on Instagram a couple weeks ago that somebody had posted. I wish I would have saved it, but it showed how builders were building a house over in Europe, and they actually found a Roman mosaic on the ground underneath where they were digging out for this house. And it wasn't even like registered as a historic site or anything. And in fact, the other house had just been built directly on top of it, and there's no way that the builders of the house didn't see it. And so you have to think, how is stuff like that missed? And there are actually several ways that stuff like that are missed. And a lot of times I think that it is intentional. Now, I don't know if this is one of those times, but it certainly goes to give an example at least of how they really could go about just kind of sweeping things under the rug that they don't want the general public to know about. So, in a strange turn of events, researchers in Mexico had to rebury an unusual archaeological monument found in the outskirts of Mexico City, covering up an important historical discovery until some unknown time in the future. Because, yes, that makes total sense. It's so important that they're just going to bury it back up and they don't even know when they're going to actually unbury it again. Yeah, that makes total sense. The discovery in question is a tunnel built centuries ago as part of the, forgive me if I don't know how to say this right, Albarradón de Ecatepec, a flood control system of dikes and waterways constructed to protect the historical city of Tenochtitlan from rising waters. Tenochtitlan, widely viewed as the capital of the Aztec Empire, featured numerous dam systems to prevent flooding from torrential rains, but Spanish conquistadors failed at first to appreciate the ingenuity of this indigenous infrastructure, destroying many of the pre-Hispanic constructions in the early years of Spanish colonization. And that is one thing that we actually know does happen, is that when new populations move in, very often artifacts are destroyed, sometimes just out of ignorance, sometimes deliberately. I believe that that happens a lot in wars, and I know that a lot of you also believe that that is done intentionally in a lot of wars. Who can forget about, what was it, the Library of Alexandria? And it was one of the most extensive libraries ever, and it was just lost. It was just obliterated. Anyway, let's just continue reading here. However, after numerous floods inundated the early colonial Mexico City, I'm not even going to try to say it again, and other flood control systems like it were built or repaired in the early 1600s. Centuries later, archaeologists with the National Institute of Anthropology and History discovered one such feature, finding in 2019 a tunnel that preserved a unique synthesis of the cultures that created it. And I'm just going to go down. I'm not going to keep reading all of it, but it says that they found several pre-Hispanic glyphs displayed in the structure. And it says that it's an important and unusual discovery. And in total, 11 symbols, and that's what they're telling us, were discovered, including representations of a war shield, the head of a bird of prey, and raindrops, among others. It's thought the symbols may have been built into the tunnel by non-Hispanic residents from the towns of Ecatepec and Chiconotla, who helped to construct that. So, I don't know if that is all that they found, the 11 symbols that they're talking about here, but the point is that they're telling us how important this discovery is, but they're just going to rebury it because as of right now, they don't have the funding that they need in order to keep excavating it. And while that may be the case, it certainly seems a little odd, but you also have to wonder, is there actually something that was found that disrupts the mainstream historical narrative, something that might, you know, force them to change those history books that people so often don't want changed. And a lot of times those of us who live in the United States, we often think of this as being something that is just like something that happens in our country, but I assure you this is happening all over the world where history is being rewritten. It's not just one country that it's happening at. And it does say that everything that they found is Roman and Spanish influence. And then it says it was intended to be made into a public exhibit so that people could visit and inspect this unusual centuries old fusion of Aztec and Spanish cultural elements. But unfortunately, it's not to be. And then it goes on to say down here that the decision was largely due to the economic impacts of the, I'm not going to say it, crisis in Mexico, because I don't want anything, getting flagged in my video just for even mentioning it. But anyway, you have to think if they were actually going to make this into a public exhibit, that would be a moneymaker, wouldn't it? That should bring in all kinds of money. And we know that people travel to Mexico all the time on vacations, and there are always tourists there. And this would be another fantastic tourist attraction. So that should definitely, make up for any lost revenue. But they decided to just kind of scratch it until who knows when, if ever. And again, you have to wonder, is it because they found something that they just didn't want people to know? So then I was just digging around some more, just because I was curious about the whole idea of reburying a complete site. And I found this. Why would we rebury ancient sites? And it says when we bury something, it's usually because it's dead or we want to hide it. But what if burying something actually extended its life? And that does make sense. If you have something that is super, super old and they're not going to be able to do anything with it for the time being, and they recover it just to keep, its integrity, that is completely understandable. But for something to be reburied and then for them to just say, oh, we don't know when we're ever going to get back to it in the future, that is something that really does raise suspicion. So it just says here, and I'm not going to read the whole article. I say this in every video in which I show articles. I always leave links to them in the description box if you want to take a look at them for yourself. But it says when we bury something, it's usually because it's dead or we want to hide it. But what if burying something actually extended its life? It may seem counterintuitive, but sometimes burying excavated ancient art and architecture is the best way to keep it safe from environmental and human threats. This is the case for cultural heritage sites all over the globe, from the world's oldest preserved footprints to dazzling Roman floor mosaics. Speak of the devil, Roman floor mosaics. And see, that's the problem. When they rebury things, how often are they forgotten? And is this deliberate? And it brings to mind that Roman mosaic that was found underneath a house. How often does this happen? And what exactly is it that we're not seeing because these things happen? We'll just read a little bit more. It says there are many scenarios where reburial is the best option for an excavated heritage site. Exposure to a harsh environment, human threats like looting, excessive tourism, or simply walking on fragile remains, and the lack of resources to adequately protect a site can all factor into a decision to rebury. Most often, it's a combination of these things that influences the decision. And I want to reiterate the fact that, yes, I definitely agree that this can help some sites. So I don't want people to think that I'm saying that the only reason that things would ever get reburied is because they're hiding something. That's not what I'm saying at all. But I'm saying that these are some very convenient tactics that are already put in place that could be used by, some pretty unsavory characters who decide that, what, the general public doesn't need to know about this. So let's just kind of sweep this under the rug and nobody's, the wiser. So anyway, let's just take a look at some of the stuff here. Here's the ruins of a great house at Chaco Canyon. And it says, are difficult and dangerous for visitors to access. They were partially reburied, and that shows here on the right, to preserve original masonry and wood. So, and every time you see that UNESCO is involved, to me that raises a red flag. And I'm not going to get into UNESCO today, but if you haven't, that's certainly something that's worth your time. Anyway, it says here the Laetoli hominid trackway after re-excavation and conservation. The reburial included layers of local soils, sieved to remove acacia tree seeds and specialized geosynthetic materials. So what they're doing here is they have these footprints and they are reburying it. And this looks, like synthetic materials, but then they're going to be using soil too. I don't know if the soil is underneath, but on top, but that is certainly something that would concern me. Just something like footprints, because we know what happens with especially geological finds like this, especially footprints, that they often get destroyed. I believe that happened. It was, they said that it was a dinosaur track next to a human footprint in the same layer of strata, and then it was kind of demolished. So again, we're hearing all this stuff secondhand. We don't know if it actually happened that way, but when they're burying things like that, that really does make me think. But anyway, so there's a whole article here about why they would, kind of rebury things and how they would do them. And it's just something that is worth your time if you're interested in stuff like that. So then I started thinking about other ways. So we have that they reburied at the other site, and here it talks about reburying, but what about when they are completely restricting access to certain areas? Even by archaeologists, they are not even allowing archaeologists in unless they are state archaeologists. And that happens more often than you'd realized. And one time that I remember was actually on, and I talked about this, I think, in one of my other videos, an episode of America Unearthed with Scott Wolter, and he went in to see a mound site in Georgia, and he was actually flat out denied access to it. And so I happened to find this today, and it says the Mayas in Georgia thing, what you were never told. And it says this is posted by the director and principal investigator, architect, urban planner at the Appalachia Foundation. The U.S. Forest Service office in Gainesville, Georgia, really did refuse permission for the History Channel, which is actually surprising because they're as mainstream as you can get. But anyway, they did refuse permission for the History Channel and National Geographic Channel to film the ruins at Track Rock Gap in Georgia. It was not a publicity gimmick. Both the Creek and Cherokee Indians used names for the province around Track Rock Gap that mean place of the Itza. The discoveries of several remarkable stone architecture complexes in the Georgia mountains and Piedmont during the last 3 years are going to radically change the understanding of the southeastern North America prior to 1700 AD. And that, my friends, is very often what the problem is. They don't want things to radically change. They want to keep things in the status quo. They don't want to change those textbooks. They don't want to change the narrative of evolution. Everything just has to stay on the same path that they've already set it on, no matter what the evidence says. And that's where burying the evidence comes in. That's where restricting access comes in. It says they are massive in scale. Several are a half mile to a mile in diameter. One in metropolitan Atlanta, which was destroyed by construction of a regional shopping mall and office park, was 2 miles long. So I just skipped forward a little bit here, and it says, while the national media provided brief, superficial coverage of the Track Rock Terrace complex in 2012, there was a news blackout in Georgia. And that's something else that we see. Are news blackouts. All of those mainstream media organizations that most, I call them normies, go to, they They don't report on the things that they don't want people to know about. So a lot of times, if you are using other news sources that are not, like ABC, NBC, Fox, CNN, people are just going to say, oh, well, that's not reputable. Well, that's because they've been conditioned to believe that anything is not reputable if it is not one of those mainstream news organizations. But the fact is that they just pretty much spout propaganda and what they are told. So news blackouts are actually very they work because so many people will only trust those news organizations. So if it's not reported on in those stations, then it mustn't be true, right? So anyway, discussion in Georgia of the spectacular Track Rock site, which covers a half square mile, have been squashed by invisible people with apparently infinite political influence. And that's a lot of it too, politics. No journalist in the national media explained that there were several terrorist sites in Georgia. To the media, Track Rock was just a controversy to attract readers and viewers for a day or two. And that's what they do. They kind of try to brush you off as conspiracy theorists, make you look crazy, make you look like you're making something out of nothing, when in fact you were the one that was right all along. And we have seen that happening, have we not? Just recently. These discoveries did not appear out of thin air, as one Georgia archaeologist stated in 2012. During the 1970s, three brilliant men, Dr. Arthur Kelly, architect Ike Saporta, and Dr. Roman Pina-Chan, director of the Museo Nacional de Antropologia, I don't even know, in Mexico City, planted the seeds that were to sprout 4 decades later. So again, this just goes on to talk more about that, but it does say that, yes, Scott Wolter on his show, History Channel, National Geographic, even they were denied access to this site. And again, it makes you think. And actually, there was another episode of America Unearthed where they were discussing giant bones. And of course, the Smithsonian came up. And the Smithsonian is yet another tactic that is used to bury things. And because giant bones were very often, like they would call the Smithsonian because, that's a reputable museum. It's the National Museum. So send them off to the Smithsonian and then the bones would get lost, never to be seen again. And so that made me start thinking about the Smithsonian. Now, this one, of course, you'll see is on Gaia.com. And that's because the only place that you will see this spoken of on mainstream websites is to debunk it. Infamous fact checkers like Snopes, and I think one is Fact Checker, another one is Reuters. Of course, all those people that they kind of put out there to try to spew whatever propaganda they want you to know at the time. But let's just read this interesting article. This conspiracy claims the Smithsonian destroys giant skeletons. And, I have to say that if you are someone who has never looked into the Smithsonian, you would probably think to yourself that is crazy. They are all about, science and history and finding the truth. But that's not really what the Smithsonian is about. Now, yes, when it was first started, I believe that it had much more integrity and they really did want the truth. But as so many things have done over the years, it has just morphed into something that is just about hiding things. It's about secrets. So around the turn of the 20th century, the New York Times, London Globe, and Scientific American published articles purporting the discovery of gigantic human skeletons, concluding that the remains were sent to the Smithsonian for further study. But the fact that this evidence was never again seen or reported continues to elicit questions of whether the Smithsonian destroys giant skeletons in order to cover up an inconvenient anomaly in the archaeological narrative we've been told. The question has been heatedly debated over the past century or more, with researchers finding what appears to be corroborating evidence, while skeptics say the bones were simply those of massive prehistoric animals, reclassified by the Smithsonian and displayed in museums to this day. And that in itself, I have to tell you, does not make sense because they would not have human-like skulls if they were massive prehistoric animals. Anyway, moving on. And while physical evidence remains tenuous, there is a seemingly endless trail of written and anecdotal suggestion that a larger race of humans once walked the earth. And I actually have a book. I'm trying to look at my shelf right from where I'm sitting, and of course I can't see it from here, but I do have a book that literally the entire book is filled with actual pictures of articles that are in newspapers many, many, many decades ago about giant bones being discovered. So there is so much written evidence in periodicals that, back in those days, they weren't afraid to report on that sort of thing because it wasn't considered taboo yet. Anyway, and see, and we have examples like that. And that's really what the book that I have is filled with, stuff like this one here. Anyway, a brief history of the Smithsonian. Though it may not be immediately obvious, the Smithsonian Institution is an extension of the U.S. government, with congressional members sitting on its board of regents. It was initially founded as an establishment for the increase and diffusion of knowledge among men, at the endowment of philanthropist, chemist, and mineralogist James Smithson. And while it's not a regulatory agency, it is so intrinsically tied to government that it claims immunity from state and local regulations, as well as immunity from lawsuits, unless authorized by Congress. The Smithsonian was established in 1846 and was tasked with the mission of organizing the anthropological history of the United States. It is sometimes referred to as the nation's attic, as it has amassed somewhere in the range of 154 million items between its myriad museums, research centers, and various facilities. But with phrases like diffusing knowledge coming from a government agency that's been influencing the course of history since the Eurocentric days of Manifest Destiny, one might be skeptical about what kind of knowledge was spread and what powers it served. Richard Dewhurst, author of The Ancient Giants Who Ruled America, points to a man. I actually think that's the book I was talking about. I'm not sure. I'll probably figure that out after I'm done with this video. I don't feel like getting up to look right now. But anyway, points to a man named John Wesley Powell, the U.S. Director of Ethnology in 1879, who ran the Smithsonian in its nascent years. In his research, Dewhurst uncovered what he refers to as the Powell Doctrine, something that I have actually talked about in one of my prior videos about giants and the Smithsonian. A paper issued on behalf of the Smithsonian, which issued a decree that no anthropological research should consider any talk of lost tribes henceforth, while also describing natives as uncultured, savage, and lacking signs of higher intellect. Hence, it will be seen that it is illegitimate to use any pictographic matter of a date anterior to the discovery of the continent by Columbus for historic purposes, Powell wrote. It's unclear whether this was Powell's decision or if it came from instructions on high. However, Dewhurst believes its clear Manifest Destiny tone led to the subsequent Smithsonian cover-up of an ancient race of giants who preceded Native Americans. Let me see. And I'm not going to read the whole article because we'll be here all night. The Smithsonian destroys giant skulls. Looking back at newspaper clippings dating from the late 1800s into the early 1900s, Dewhurst found a multitude of instances in which citizens from disparate areas of the country uncovered massive bones of seemingly human origin. Upon reporting these discoveries to media outlets or authorities, Dewhurst said unsuspecting citizens would shortly receive a visit from members of the Smithsonian, who wasted no time sequestering the bones, allegedly bringing them to a museum or research facility, but which were never seen again. And this is something that, yes, it happened over and over again, but the mainstream will deny that any of this ever happened. One could also find instances of giant skulls and skeletons in local papers with pictures to boot. Take, for instance, this photo from the San Antonio Press showing a giant skull next to two normal skulls for size comparison. So that, my friends, that's not a prehistoric animal. That's a human-like skull. Anyway, it's worth mentioning that the time period when these skeletal remains were found was drastically different from today. Amen. Yellow journalism was rampant even for some of the publications we might consider more esteemed. Religion was also a dominating factor in many people's lives, and attempts to find literal instances of biblical stories was highly sought after, which is true. And that is something that I try to do too. I am trying to find evidence, not because I need it, but because I want to share it with people, with other people who feel that they might need it, and because I find it pretty darn interesting. So, this has become one of the primary arguments against these accounts, as naysayers believe people created counterfeit skeletons or confused the bones of prehistoric megafauna and large animals for humans, hoping they had found proof in the existence of the Nephilim of the Old Testament. And I do have to point out that also, when it comes to the evolutionary model, so many hoaxes were found in there. And in fact, some of those hoaxes are still in biology books today. For example, if you've ever heard of Ernst Haeckel's drawings, he was a scientist who claimed that he drew all these embryo pictures of different animals and humans, and that they all looked the same in the embryonic stage. And it was basically just to show that people are just like every other animal, when in fact it turned out that the drawings were a hoax. But interestingly, those drawings are still in biology books, and they're not in biology books as a hoax. They're in there to, again, they're as if they're legitimate. So anyway, let's just see if we can go down. Does it even talk about it? No. So it doesn't talk about it, but there are stories that they were actually dumped off of a ship. Not all of them, obviously, but that some of them were dumped off of a ship in the middle of the ocean. So we don't know, but even if you don't believe something like this, okay, well, that's too far-fetched. That's just not going to happen. All right, that's fine. I'll give you that. But here we have the Center for Public Integrity investigating inequality, and this is Smithsonian inventory in disarray, but museum says it didn't lose Washington's bed. And I didn't come on here because I was concerned that they lost Washington's bed, although, okay, that would be sad if that was true. But that's not why I came here. I wanted to see what it had to say about them losing other things and just how disorganized they actually are. So it says the Smithsonian is often likened to America's attic, and a Watchdog semi-annual report indicates that several of the 19 museums in the Smithsonian system have some of the same housekeeping challenges shared by families with overstuffed closets. The report raised questions about missing items and inaccurate and incomplete inventories at the National Museum of American History, National Museum of Natural History, and National Air and Space Museum. In a sample of 2,216 items from the National Museum of American History's inventory, the watchdog found roughly 10% of the items missing. Those missing objects included 33 that's interesting, 33 Tier 4 objects, which are defined as national treasures or valued at greater than $1 million. So if they're admitting that they already have misplaced all of this stuff, you don't know what's in there. So that is certainly another easy way to kind of hide things, is if they just accidentally misplaced them. Oh, I don't know whatever happened to that, or I've never heard of that. It's not in my inventory. Well, that's because your inventory isn't up to date. Then again, if it was ever even put in your inventory to begin with, right? And I just want to close out this video with reading to you something that I had actually shared in another video. Again, it was the video up, I believe it was the one about the giants in the Smithsonian. And this is from the book Unearthing the Lost Worlds of the Cloud Eaters by Stephen Quayle and Dr. Thomas R. Horn, so Tom Horn. And they also went into the history of the Smithsonian Institution and the Powell Doctrine, which I just read to you about a couple minutes ago. So here is what Steve Quayle had to say about this. The museum established the excuse me, I'm getting over a cold, so I still can't speak right all the time. Anyway, the museum established the Powell Doctrine as a literal official policy to exclude any and all alternative evaluations of the mounds. So they're talking about the mounds like in Ohio, the ones that I talked about in Georgia, bones, pictographs, and human origin hypotheses, regardless of evidence. Any perspective, no matter how scientifically sound, would be snuffed out under the suppressive abort button of the doctrine. After 1907, it would not matter what was found in the ground. The policy was solid. No opinion other than Powell's would ever matter to the Smithsonian again. Most documentation has been collected that follows an unscrupulous trajectory from various archaeological digs to the Smithsonian as research teams are submitting their finds to the museum for study and/or display, and the trail goes dark at that point. The bones the Smithsonian is receiving are not making their way to the museum floor or laboratories, and nary is a word uttered that they were ever submitted after they were unearthed. Those who contribute the bones to the museum do so in naive trust that the Smithsonian will appeal to the government for grants and additional research funds. But because of the policy, the buck stops there, and that in turn affects the budget allowance for universities to follow up with any kind of field study for tomorrow's generation of scientists. They don't want things like this being investigated. So when things like this were being turned into the Smithsonian, they were not returning them. They were conveniently losing them. They were misnaming them, probably mislabeling them, and who knows what else was going on. But this is not something that is new. As we can see, there are so many different ways that new finds that even amateur archaeologists are finding nowadays, they're getting swept under the rug. They're getting covered up. When something is found, the government agencies swoop in. They don't allow anyone from the outside, and that's pretty much the end of that. And, I have to say that a lot of times, a lot of the findings that they find, especially when it comes to dinosaur bones, it always seems that they're conveniently found when there are school trips or when there are government archaeologists, like state archaeologists around. It's almost as if they are planted there. So I think it actually works on both ends. The things that they want you to see are kind of planted, and oh, look what we found. And the things that they don't want you to see, oh no, well, I don't know what you're talking about. That's really what I think happens a lot. But anyway, what was supposed to be just like a short video, because I found this article, actually turned out to be pretty long. But anyway, that's all that I have for you today. If you like this video, give it a thumbs up. If you haven't subscribed yet and would like to hear more of what I have to say, I would love if you would do that. If you have any questions or comments, you can leave one either here or over on Instagram. And if you like my work and would like to check out my Patreon page, I will leave a link in the description box for that as well. And I hope you have a great day.